Hi, I'm Felicia, and today I'm going to talk about man in the middle attack. Introduction. What is man in the middle attack? Man in the middle attack is a general term for when a perpetrator positioned himself in a conversation between a user and an application, either to eavesdrop or to impersonate one of the parties, making it appear as if a normal exchange of information is underway. So usually the attacker places himself in the middle when the user is trying to interact with the web application, and the attacker can basically spy those interaction between the user and the web application. And through this spy of interaction, the attacker can basically like do something malicious with it or steal information. So what is the goal of the attacker? So the goal of the attacker is basically to steal information such as login credentials, account details, and credit card numbers. Targets are typically the users of financial application, SAA business, e-commerce sites, and other websites where logging in is required. Because the attacker can spy and know all of the interaction between the user and the web application. So every time the user is trying to access the web server and where they had to like those privacy like important information such as they're trying to log in with their login credential and password, the attacker can know those things, those privacy, and can do something malicious with it, such as like they're basically like credit card numbers and login credential. Information obtained during an attack could be used for many purposes. So there is many purpose. If the user has this information, it could be for like identity theft and unapproved fund transfer. And if they know the password and the login credential, they could change the password so that the real user could not log in again, and the attacker can do something malicious with their account. So there's many types of man-in-the-middle attacks. And so there's like ARP poisoning, internet protocol spoofing, domain name system spoofing, HTTP spoofing, secure socket layer hijacking, email hijacking, Wi-Fi eavesdropping, session hijacking, and many more. But today I'm gonna discuss one of the types of man-in-the-middle attack, which is ARP poisoning. So first is, what is IP and MAC addresses? So IP address is basically every user has their own IP address, and every web server has their own IP address. And MAC address is more used to the communication. So it's used for communication between one user to another user, or the user to the web server. So how they communicate, and they need to know their MAC address in order to communicate between them. So ARP, what is ARP? ARP is basically the interaction and communication between one user to another user. So for instance, user A wants to communicate with user D. So user A knows the IP address of user D, which is 192.168.0.4. So user A wants to communicate with user B, but user A cannot communicate with user B without knowing the user B MAC address. So user A is basically will call out, hey, who has an IP address of 1.9.168.0.4, and user D will say, this is me, and user A will ask user D MAC address in order to communicate with user D, and so user D will give their MAC address to user A, and so here's my MAC address, and user A can communicate with user B. if user A has the MAC address of user D. So once user A has the MAC address of user D, they will store it in a cache named ARP cache. So this is 1.9.168.0.4 is the IP address of user D. And this dd/dd, this one is the MAC address of user D. So the user A will store all of these information in the ARP cache. So next time if user A wants to communicate with user D again, user A does not have to like broadcast who has this IP address, can I have the MAC address? So it's already stored in the ARP cache. So what if user A wants to communicate with the web server, which is outside the domain? So in order for user A to communicate with with the web server, it has to go through the router. So it's basically the default gateway. So it has to go through the default gateway, and then it can go through the web server. So it cannot be like automatic. So user A will ask, hey, can I have the MAC address whose IP address is 1.2.168.0.254, and the router will say that's me, and then the user A will communicate through the router to be able to go to the web server, to communicate to the web server. Okay, so ARP poisoning, the methodology. So how do you make this attack? How does this attack works? So first, it interrupts user traffic through the attacker network before it reaches its intended destination. The most common and simplest way of doing it is basically in which an attacker makes free malicious Wi-Fi hotspot available to the public. So this is like the first step, like malicious hotspot in order for the attacker to be in that middle spot. Typically named in a way that correspond to their location. They aren't password protected. Once a victim connects to such a hotspot, the attacker gains full visibility to any online data exchange. So Wi-Fi can be very dangerous because a malicious Wi-Fi hotspot can make the attacker be in that middle of the interaction between the user and the web server. This is the process of linking an attacker MAC address with the IP address of a legitimate user on a local network using fake ARP messages. As a result, data sent by the user to the host IP address is instead transmitted to the attacker. So the user wouldn't know that the attacker is in the middle of their conversation between the user and the web server. So instead of the information that's supposed to be sent from the user to the web server, the user will send it through the attacker, but without the user notice about it. So here's the thing. So first, the user is trying to access the web server. So the user will go through the router, goes to the web server, right? It will ask like through the router, so it will store the IP address and the MAC address in the ARP cache. And then it can communicate with the web server. It has to go through the router. And this is the attacker. So the attacker wants to be in the middle of the interaction, and so this, okay, sorry. So then the attacker, basically because the attacker is in the middle of the interaction, the attacker spies on the interaction between user A and the web server through the router. So before, the MAC address is RRRRR, which is the MAC address of this router. But then the attacker, because the attacker is placed in the middle of the interaction, the attacker basically spies the information and change the MAC address of the router to their MAC address through the attacker MAC address. So now the MAC address BBBBBB is the attacker MAC address. So the attacker managed to change the MAC address from the router MAC address to their MAC address, to the attacker MAC address. So because the attacker managed to change the MAC address to their MAC address, whatever user A wants to send, so when user A sends something which is intended to send for the web server, because the MAC address is the attacker, the user will send information and everything, and it goes to the attacker because the MAC address is the attacker MAC address and not the router MAC address, without the user noticing about it. So the user doesn't know that this MAC address is the attacker because the attacker changed it without the user noticing about it. So all the information that the user sends, which is intended for the web server, it goes to the attacker. This is what it's called man-in-the-middle attack. So man-in-the-middle attack, which the attacker places himself in the middle between the interaction of the user and the web server. And so when the information goes to the attacker here, the attacker can basically do anything with the information. It can do malicious thing. So for example, the user wants to access the web server, like to access like their account, for instance, and they have to type their username and they have to type their password without the user noticing about it. When they send the information, it is sent to the attacker. So the attacker gets the username, the password, and not the web server. But the user doesn't know about it. So the attacker can do malicious things with it before it sends to the web server. And this is dangerous. That's why this is man-in-the-middle attack. It's basically the interaction between the user and the web server. There is the attacker that do malicious thing with the information. So how to prevent this attack from happening? So first is use secure connection. Don't ever use like there's so many that's not like secure, like connection HTTP. Like try to avoid, always use secure connections, like, and then avoid phishing emails, use VPN and strong router login credentials so that the attacker wouldn't be able to guess easily and stuff. So first is secure connection. So secure connection, HTTP is not a secure connection. Always use HTTPS. So trusted website is always HTTPS, and always use HTTPS to avoid this attack from happening. And always see if the signs indicates a secure website in the URL. Usually there is like, when it's a secure website, it will display a sign that is like secure website. Like I said, avoid it's very dangerous sometimes, like unsecured Wi-Fi or malicious hotspot Wi-Fi can, if you connect there, the attacker can place himself and spy through all the in like the communication between you and the web server. So always avoid unsecured public Wi-Fi connections. Phishing emails. Avoid phishing emails. So usually the attacker will send, like the attacker will send an email to trick you to opening the email. And then when you open the email, there is a link that you will click that makes you want to click, and then it will take you to an unsecure website. And this website may look like it is secure, but it is not secure, because sometimes the hacker can create a website that looks similar as the real website, but then it is not secure. And then when it's not secure, but you thought that was real, you put in your like information such as login, password, credit card numbers, and those information is not secured and will get through to the attacker, to the hacker. And so please avoid those kinds of happening, and always watch out. Like you need to watch out for emails that is like not real, like unsecure emails. Also always use VPN. So VPNs encrypts internet connection and online data transfers, such as password and credit card. And so if you are connecting with an unsecure Wi-Fi or like public Wi-Fi networks, always use VPN to prevent this man-in-the-middle attack, because it will encrypt internet connection and it will encrypt like online data transfer, like any information. So it prevents the hacker from doing this attack, since all the interaction are encrypted by the VPN. It's very important. It makes your internet connection secure and your communication between you and the web server secure, since it encrypts basically your information. Next is router login credentials. So it's very important to use a strong router login credential so that the hacker can't access your system. Therefore, changing your default login credential, your router login credential, to something stronger is very important. So as we can see, in the previous slide, sorry, that I showed about like the man-in-the-middle attack, these router is very important, right? Because since it is the gateway for the victim to communicate with the web server. So if the hacker can change the router MAC address to their MAC address, all the information, all the data will go to the hacker. So that is why it is very important to make your router have a strong login credential and change the default one to a very strong one. And so now is, what is the conclusion? So there are lots of cyber attacks happening, and we need to be aware of this type of attack happening. Understanding this attack and why we only need to access secure connection, watch for unsecure emails using VPN, and strong router credentials is important to help prevent this attack. Nowadays, this attack is not common, and it is much safer than it was before, such as HTTP, VPT, and Telnet that use plain text have all been replaced with a much more secure protocol, such as HTTPS. So nowadays, it's just a lot safer because people know and there's a safer protocols that won't let this attack from happening, but we still need to be aware of it. So the attack requires data to be sent in a clear text, and that is why HTTP and FTP and Telnet that uses plain text works for this attack. That is why we should only use HTTPS, since HTTPS is not data that is sent in a clear text. So, and also 90% of traffic now over the network is also encrypted. So that makes it secure. Like using a VPN also encrypts all your network connections and your communication and your traffic and your data. This attack still happens nowadays, and detecting this man-in-the-middle attack are difficult. That is why we still need to be aware of this attack from happening, and it is very important to know how to prevent them using the factor that I explained in the previous slides. So we need to still be aware of this attack because it could still happen nowadays, and prevent it using the previous factor that I explained in the previous slides. And this is the reference page, the works cited. Thank you.